Okay, good. So very warm welcome today to me, John Wilks, and my colleague and friend, Josephine. And really we're delighted to welcome Will Parfitt, who's talking to us from Glastonbury today. So Josie, you're going to introduce Will, I think.
Yes. Hello, everybody. And hello to John, and a very big welcome to Will. So pleased you found time to speak to us today, Will. Just a bit about Will before we go into the talk that Will give us. Will has explored personal and spiritual development for more than 50 years. He's trained in psychosynthesis and is a Kabbalah teacher. Will lives in Glastonbury, as John's already mentioned. Will has lived with death all his life, possibly because of a life-saving operation when he was a baby, but definitely because since his teens, the reality of death has been a constant companion, at times a source of fear and at times a great comfort. And today Will's talking about his book that he wrote, the title, The Something and Nothing of Death. His book explores many different ways of looking at death, and it is intended to bring an honest inquiry to the subject and an acceptance of something we cannot evade. Bottom line is that we all die, so let's engage with this essential part of life with curiosity and interest. And in the times we're living at, death has been very much brought to the forefront of our thoughts and consideration, and I thought it was a very apt time for us to talk with Will, who's got a considerable insight into this. So thank you, Will, and I'm just going to let you go free flow, and okay. if we feel the need to ask you questions, we will. Okay.
Okay, well, I hope you do ask some questions, because I'll run out of free flow probably. Just picking up on one thing there, I don't think anybody is an expert on death. I don't think anybody, we can have an enormous amount of information about what happens to us before we die, but despite various theories and ideas and experiences that individuals have that seem to tell us about what happens after we're dead, we don't really know. That's actually, I have a copy of my book sitting here. Before doing this talk with you, Josephine, I got out a copy of this book. It's been out for quite a while now, and being the author of the book, I haven't actually read it since, ages ago. So I thought, I better have a look inside to know what we're going to talk about. And I opened up at one page and it was kind of interesting. But then I realized that actually there was nothing in here that, there's a lot in the book, but there's nothing in here that's actually kind of the truth of where I'm going to be at today. I want to be sort of fluid and honest. And so the most important thing in this book, really, for me, is the title, The Something and Nothing of Death. When I was, I don't know, about 14 or 15, I had some sort of kind of strange breakdown experience. And through that, I came to this, that death is something and nothing. Well, I came originally to the idea that death is something or nothing. So when we die, there's either going to be something or there's going to be nothing. If there's something, my attitude to that is, well, gosh, wow, there really is something. That's quite astonishing. Assuming I'm there to recognize what that something is. And if there's nothing after death, well, then I'm not, definitely by definition, there's nothing, so I'm not going to know about it. So in a way, recognizing that what happens after death is something completely unknown and mysterious to us is a release rather than a bind upon us, because it's a win-win situation. We're either there and there's something, or we're not there and there's nothing. A little bit, as I've kind of spent my life in a way, kind of coming back to this and reflecting on it in different ways, I eventually came to what's the title of the book, which is not the something or nothing of death, but the something and nothing of death. Because if we make it an either or situation in any sense in life, and particularly in terms of life and death, it makes death something that's separate and out there. It's not part of life. Whereas what seems to work best, certainly for me and people I've worked with in years with this, is to accept that death is most definitely not separate from life or the end of life, but is actually part of life. It's an integral, essential part of life. Does this make sense, what I'm talking about so far?
No, absolutely, absolutely. It is something that we do have to consider. We are constantly sort of moving on. It's sort of, we do come to places of death psychologically in our life sometimes, and then so that's where I get the analogy from. It's processes, stages of life.
The first chapter of the book, I start with a quote from it's one of those famous Zen Buddhist quotes, and the student asks the Zen master, "What happens after we die?" And the Zen master says, "I don't know." And the student says, "But you're the master, you should know." And the Zen master says, "Yeah, but I'm not dead yet." And that kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I find, for myself personally, I find it really quite easy to go to quite negative places about death, you know, particularly now with this coronavirus business happening. And I'm over 70 and I've got some conditions, so I feel vulnerable, and it makes me kind of think, oh, is it safe to go out? And if I go out, I might catch the virus. And if I catch the virus, well, what? I might die. It's not the dying that's the anxious making part for me, really. It's the what might lead up to death. How I might, particularly, you know, with what we read about people in intensive care and, you know, having bags over their heads full of oxygen. And actually, it seems in most cases, once you get as far as intensive care, you're going through so much pain, you might not even be able to say goodbye to your loved ones. And then you're going to die. It seems to me to be the most horrible kind of death you can imagine. But it's the most horrible. What leads to death, what actually happens at death, still remains a mystery. Once we turn once we turn ourselves off, that's a kind of debatable thing. Do we turn ourselves off, or do we get turned off, or, you know? But once our life ends, whatever that exactly means, we're left. If there is anything of us, if there's something rather than nothing, we're left with whatever that is, the mystery. And
well, can I? Sorry.
John?
Oh, no, I don't want to interrupt you. No, I was just thinking, I mean, a couple of things really, I suppose. I mean, when we think about, you know, we were talking about early experiences before, like, it would be very difficult to say, wouldn't it, when we first said, or that we had a sensation that we were here in this life. There isn't the kind of point that we say that. And also then, when you say about this something and nothing of death. So if you say there's something, then there is something to experience, whether that's some afterlife of whatever that is, and therefore there is some being that is experiencing that thing, right?
Yeah.
And when you talk about nothing, then I think, because you said when there's nothing, there is nothing, so there wouldn't be anybody to experience nothing. There would be just nothing. which is for a lot of people maybe quite scary, or even the thought of someone experiencing nothing. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I said to you, I picked up the book to look at it, you know, when and there's, if I could, yeah, there it is. I just did so when I first picked this book up, I did a bibliomancy, you know, I flicked through the pages and I opened up, and I opened up to a chapter that's titled Immortal Soul. Wow, Immortal Soul? I wonder what that is. Anyway, so you know, I carried my bibliomancy on, and I put down, and I'll just read it to you. It's relevant, I think, very much to what you were just saying. Where do I need to start? It's natural to desire immortality. The point is in taking care which parts of us we want to be immortal. If you reflect on this for a while, I imagine you probably won't include your personal identity as it's known to you now. But if you do, then I feel safe to assert it's your ego speaking. As children, we develop ego so we can have, in this life and in this body, a sense of personal and separate identity. We confer on ego the task of holding us together, and by implication, therefore, of keeping us alive. Anything that suggests otherwise, and ego will step in and find some way of sabotaging or denying that we will cease to exist. Even as I write this, ego tried to make me write maybe rather than will cease to exist. Maybe he's right, though I doubt it. What I do know is that I am less certain of the truth than he. That was actually, I wasn't going to read anything from the book, but that little bibliomancy I did sort of summed it up for me, I think, quite well. And all our fears about what might happen, including the total annihilation, the nothingness, the oblivion of nothing, come from something that is part of us, but not the essential part of us. If I just shift to talk about psychosynthesis a little bit, the form of therapy that I've worked with through my life, it's the difference between a subpersonality, a part of us that we've created to deal with the world, and the more essential part of us, the part of us that's aware we're alive. And if we get beneath those different fears and concerns, all the attitudes towards death and life that subpersonalities have, and we come back to ourself, the self isn't concerned with whether we're here or not, what's happening yesterday or tomorrow. The self just is. So once we have that, it seems to me, I can speak for myself, once I've had that experience of being just me, then actually, for me, I'm not concerned whether there's something or nothing after death, because that's the concern of something else. My concern is just to be here in this moment as myself. Which then also seems to be quite a good, seems to me to be the essential approach to death, really. There is beauty and meaning in everything that we do in life, in every moment of life. I think the worst thing I can imagine for myself, what I was saying before, is to die alone in some hospital somewhere. My fantasy is I would make sure I died before I left the house if I was being rushed off the hospital, because I really wouldn't want to be in a hospital. But I know from a couple of past experiences of being in hospitals, having operations, that actually even in that moment, you know, where you're just before you're going in to have the, I had a major operation some years ago, and you know, you're going in to have to see the anaesthetist and going to the operation. That's a moment when you're facing up to, you might not ever come out of that. You might. The parts of me that had got myself or had ended up with me being in hospital, the parts of me that didn't want to be in hospital, that hated the idea of being in hospital, it was worse than anything I could possibly imagine. I was kicking and screaming going into the hospital, but by the time I'm there and being in it, it's like, well, this is my experience now. And as long as this is my experience now, and I keep with that, I mean, this is me. I'm not suggesting this is true for anybody else, but I was making jokes with the anaesthetist. So the last thing I actually remember, or I remember having as an experience, apart from counting down the numbers as the anaesthetic worked, was making a joke. And I think that's something quite important about that. It's what we have to take seriously is something essential inside ourselves, which now, at this moment, is eternal. Future or past, whether I'm dead or alive in this body, doesn't really seem to be that significant anymore. Once I come to just, this is me here now. This is me after the operation I was just describing. Somebody brought me some beautiful big bouquet of flowers, and they were on a shelf just on a window ledge just behind the bed. And the very first thing I was aware of after I came round after the operation was some ants just sort of crawling over my face and down the side of my head. And it's quite sort of strange, but it transpired that there was a window open in the ward, one of the very few windows in the ward, and a line of ants were coming in through the window, along the window ledge, climbing all around the flowers, and then deciding to come down onto the bed and crawl down my face. Now, if I think of it, you're laughing, I'm laughing, because I think of that now, and it's like, oh God. But actually, in the moment, this is a very strange thing to say, I think, but in the moment, actually, it was interesting, it was engaging. Gosh, I'm alive, and there's an ant crawling on my face. You see what I'm getting at? That it's what's happening in the moment is always there. It's not, I'm going to do something after this talk we're having now, and I was doing something before. But they're not here now. What's here now is us having this conversation, and that seems to be the truth of life and death.
I might be coming from a very biased position, but likewise, I feel very, very comfortable with psychosynthesis, and having been trained eclectically, when I came to the psychosynthesis model, it was as though everything that had ever happened in my life and the way I perceive things was recognized by psychosynthesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So of course I became very interested in it and went on to do most of my work, which is a very eclectic psychosynthesis, but within that model, and that model of being this center part, this living being, and to be able to see, oh, I'm going to go shoot off there and be that part of myself today. You know, that's the part that does this well. Well, that's a bit of a worrying part, but I'm not, that's those wonderful being able to draw back in. This is the moment now. This is the moment I'm experiencing. My whole attention is here. And you get a great view of it, and you engage with it, because there's something in every experience that is, I find, quite exciting. And then there's sometimes they're very grave experiences. And if you're very present at that moment, it's a time of growth and belief in this center core, that it can really, it can cope with anything, including those difficult times when you're in a hospital. You know, I've been in for operations in the last 2 years, big ones, you know, and I'm thinking, I just pull myself into that center space, and I think it's a very powerful place, and that's, to me, is almost the immortal part of us.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, exactly. This quite strong place, if you can find it and hold it. And
it's a bit like the Zen master in that little story I said before, you know, says, well, I'm not dead yet. No, but he's a Zen master because he's alive. Yeah. And being alive is being in the moment.
In that moment.
About the before or after.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So, Will, when you're talking about, you mentioned the word self, which is a big topic about why we won't go into necessarily. Yeah. But I suppose that's kind of like what partly to do with what we identify with, isn't it? In a sense of like, if we identify a lot with our ego and who we are and our, you know, our wealth or our status or whatever, it's probably true that we're more likely to feel anxiety and fear around things like death, because we're going to lose it. So, but if we identify more with maybe the self, or the, I don't know how you would describe that, but maybe something that is kind of constant, maybe is more of a witness.
Yeah, well, I think the witness or observer part of ourselves is a good thing. I mean, you know, depending on which religions and philosophies and spiritualities people follow, they can be all sorts of different ideas. We could be a certain kind, well, essential Buddhists probably, that don't actually go along with the idea that there is an individual self. However we view that, there is nevertheless, if you take away the layers of ideas about it, I think everybody has that potential in themselves to be able to step back a little bit and witness what's happening for them. And that's what I'm really meaning by the self, the part of us that isn't, I'm not being a husband to my wife, or I'm not being a therapist to my clients, or I'm not being a father to my child, or whatever. I'm just being me in this moment, and I'm witnessing what's happening in this moment. I can remember what happened in the past, and I can have fantasies about what might happen in the future. But actually, those are happening in this moment now, and I can see them happening. I think the issue often is when we get caught up into worrying and being anxious about what's happened in the past, or over. I mean, it's good to plan and be aware of the future, but to be over concerned and anxious about what's going to happen in the future, it is ego or subpersonalities, parts of ourselves that have learned in some way not to trust, just to be in the moment.
I suppose at this point now, particularly when there is a lot of fear around death and stuff. I mean, because I can feel it in myself as we speak. There's a kind of a sense of not exactly witness, but of something that an essence which is always there, which is light, which I can rest in, which is, you know, unchangeable, which somehow will always be there. And I suppose for a lot of people, maybe some people never experience that, or they it's fleeting, or they might get glimpses of it. And I suppose us, because I'm a therapist as well, as Josephine is and you are, and I mean, I suppose one of our roles can be to get people more in touch with that. I find that particularly with craniosacral work that people get in touch with it. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how we can encourage that kind of process. I mean, I know that's kind of your whole life's work, probably, isn't it? Right? But how, you know, how can people find that place in them, which is?
Well, I mean, I think I'm agreeing with what you say, that I think people often miss that in their lives, or only have fleeting moments of it. But it's not something that's sort of remote and distant. It's just a matter of coming back to oneself. So this sounds too simple, but I think it is the essence of it, really. It's to remember to breathe, to just take a breath. You know, this is an example. It's not my natural habitat to be talking like this, you know, via whatever we're doing, a link here on the internet and stuff. And also, you know, I'm always an anxious before the moment type of person. So how do I deal with that? I could come into this room here and sit in front of the screen and not do anything, and I'd be slightly more anxious than I am now, but you know, I would be caught up in it in some way. All I needed to do to change that was, as I come into the room and sit in front of the screen, I take a breath, and just as I breathe in and breathe out, I come back into my body and just be with what I'm experiencing in that moment. Of course, then, you know, things happen in life. So if I'm using this particular situation we're in, this isn't a criticism in any way. I'm not saying criticism. I'm here at 8:30 and it's 8:35. You know, so I had 5 minutes of, oh God, are they ever going to come? Oh God, anxiety is building up now. You know, I mean, actually, you know, I felt that a little bit, and then I go, you know, and then another part of me that thinks, oh well, actually, it's a good way you could avoid even having this conversation. If you're not here soon, you can go, you know. And another part of me comes in and says, Will, no, you can't say that, you know. And then I take a breath and I just come back out of that and say, wait a minute, I'm just being here now in this moment. So I think what I'm trying to illustrate is it's incredibly easy to move to that witness part of oneself. And at the same time, it's incredibly difficult because we're constantly, the inner dialogue inside ourselves, different mental parts of us, different feelings and emotions that are arising, all this stuff is constantly at us. And we need to find, if we don't find some way out of that, we end up living our lives outside of ourselves the whole time, rather than from this place inside ourselves, which not only brings us to ourselves, but also gives us a choice about what we want to do with it. If I'm, I think Josephine?
I think things like mindfulness and breathing are the key to coming in. And I think the great thing that psychosynthesis offers is that disidentification meditation, which becomes just a tool of brilliance. And if you can link, I always found if I could link that to a physical sensation, which is to do this, and I would work my clients that and in any time of crisis where you're flying around in the myriad of parts that you can go to, if you just rub those, or some people just do this, or it pulls you in, and all that panic and all those places you can run to, and you come to this point of power. And when I first used to start doing Awakening TV and it was live and we were filming, I said, this will be terrifying, but because you're in that place, you pull yourself to that. That's the extreme focus.
Yeah, and you've chosen that.
And I would say it's like you're really alive in this place. You're listening, you're looking, you're relating straight on, not thinking all these other places. So I think to be able to breathe, mindfulness, mindful walking, mindful looking at a tree, just focus on one thing is the way to get rid of all that other rubbish that interferes with us. And maybe because people are now, I know it's really difficult for people shut in their homes. Some homes are easier to live in than others. But probably for those who are not in such crowded homes, it is almost a coming home to self.
Yes. I would just pick up one thing you said there. All those voices, all those different parts of us sort of clamoring for attention. They can be incredibly annoying. They take us away from this essential aspect of ourselves we're talking about. But I wouldn't call them rubbish, because actually...
No, I agree with you. They serve us. They
serve
us. But when we want to be very quiet, we don't want to be serving a very energetic part of ourselves or a very worrying. They all serve us, and they're there to... They help us live.
Yeah, exactly.
I absolutely agree, and it's good you brought that up. So that, but when I want to focus on you, Will, and listening to what you've got to say, I don't want them drawing me away from you. So that's what I'm saying. They serve me as a functioning human being, but when I want to talk about something so important now, I want to be here with you.
Yeah, exactly. And you said that in the context of disidentification. I mean, people who don't know about psychosynthesis won't understand the word, but that's all we're talking about here. To be mindful of what we're identified with, what we're connecting with, and choosing to step away from that, to disidentify from it, to come back to ourselves. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful tool for anybody. And I have... Sorry,
let me just say one other thing.
Yes, carry on.
I don't want to lose it, because I thought perhaps the most important thing in what you just said then was bringing body into it. You were describing, just to bring your awareness in some way back to your body. I spent a long part of my life having this idea from somewhere that I was some kind of soul that had incarnated into this body. So even though all through that time I wasn't aware of it, that I know I was aware of, I was creating a duality. There was me, the soul, somehow incarnated into this body, as if somehow when the body dies, my soul is going to now go, I've had enough of that body, I'll move, or whatever. So a few years ago, it's only a very few years ago, 5 years ago or something, I just realized very deeply in myself, I was actually helped by a cat in realizing this, that I'm not incarnating in this body, I'm incarnated as this body. I mean, I'm choosing right now as a soul to incarnate. This body is my soul, it's my soul in its manifest form right now. So rather than it being a duality, there's a soul and there's a body, there's the unity of body which is soul. So every time we allow ourselves, or perhaps more significantly choose to bring ourselves back to our body, whether it's, as you were saying, to touch ourselves, to use something to remind ourselves of being here as this body, we're actually then connecting with that essential part of ourselves. We're disidentifying from all the ideas and theories and beliefs and structures, and just coming back to, again, it's the same thing. We come back to that place of essential I-ness. I am something. I'm not any of the things I can describe myself as. They're interesting to explore and to imagine. Sometimes they're frightening to explore, sometimes they're exciting, but behind all that, there's always this me, this I, this something that exists, that by making those steps backwards into oneself, one then has the possibility to step forwards with choice. So, I mean, a really good example for me is many years ago now. My parents have been dead for a long time, but I had quite a good relationship with they were great parents. I had a good relationship with them, I'll be honest. But I kind of blew that away in my later teens. You know, I left home and did all the hippie stuff, and I don't think my parents were terribly keen on me at that time, but I believed, because I was identified with that role of being a hippie and being an alternative person and all that sort of stuff. I certainly wasn't very happy with my parents. I saw them as part of the problem. But disidentification and coming back to myself and realizing, you know, that was just the structure I was holding, enabled me to not only, well, I think in a very full sense, honor my parents, but more than that, sort of realize that there's a thing in therapy. Sometimes people talk about the good enough parent. You know, it's a wonderful thing to come back to oneself, not them, to oneself, and realize you didn't have good enough parents. You had absolutely bloody amazing parents, because they brought you here. They've given you this possibility of incarnating in this way. It's wonderful.
Mm. So, well, you've got a chapter in your book called Immortal Soul, right?
Yeah.
I
think I said that, yeah.
Okay. Well, all right.
Yeah, go on.
I'm not going to hold you to that.
Okay.
No, just from what you said now, you said something very interesting, which I just maybe like to explore a bit, because most people have this notion, don't they? Common, particularly probably in Glastonbury, but like, you know, that you had an incarnation as, I don't know, a farmer, and then you incarnated as a soldier, or whatever it is, and yes, and then there's a kind of progression somehow, and that progression is to do perhaps with some kind of notion of spiritual progress or something like this, right? So I
think you hope it's progress, or you could be going
the other way. Yes. Would you like to challenge that kind of notion? Or not?
I kind of hoped you wouldn't go there. I have two responses to that, really.
Okay.
The first response is, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows. Nobody has really the truth of that. So I mentioned in the book, actually, some examples. Some of them are very well known. The best example I've ever come across, I saw a TV program once, maybe you saw it. There was a young Indian boy, I think he was only about 5 or 6 or something, and he kept telling his parents that he'd lived a previous life and he'd died in a particular Indian city somewhere. Mm. And they were very, I think, you know, very dubious and disbelieving. I think they were quite secular in their lifestyle. But he went on about it so much that in the end they took him to, and this was filmed, they took him to the city, and he took them to a particular street, and he said, I lived in that shop there, above that shop. And they went into the shop, and this little boy, I can't remember the exact details, but he basically says to the woman behind the counter, hello dear, I've come back to see you. You were my wife in my past life. Of course, she also doesn't believe a word of this. It's totally and utterly ridiculous. Until he whispers something in her ear. And then she knows that it's something that only she and he could possibly have ever known. Now, you know, you can come up with all kinds of explanations for that. I mean, maybe he picked something up on the collective unconscious, or I don't know, but all the explanations you come up with, often, when people do come up with explanations for these things, they often seem actually a little crazier than the idea that actually some people, for some reason at least, if not everyone, do have more than one life. How could this little boy remember it? There's lots of these stories. I'm sure we all know some of them. I mean, if it's a a Tibetan, a bunch of Tibetan monks looking for their reincarnated Lama and go looking for the child that recognizes the Lama's possessions. That's a good example too. But we can go, oh yeah, but I mean, they're monks and they're Tibetan monks, so they must be very special in some way. But it's ordinary people have these experiences and memories. Now, I'm still saying though, and I think it's the only thing we can truthfully say, I don't know. I don't know whether that boy or me or either of you had past lives or are going to have future lives. There's no way we can know that for sure. But considering, I think it's true, I think it's still true, it has been true, that over half of the people on our planet actually do believe there is some kind of past and future life stuff.
Yeah.
And many ordinary people, often with embarrassment, will describe some kind of memory of something. If you actually check it out with them, it seems to me it's a good bet that maybe that could be it.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had experiences a bit like that, which are difficult to explain. I suppose coming back, then this may be, you maybe not want to go there, but and say if you don't. But I suppose in many religions, well, some religions, there is this notion of an incarnated soul, as we said, and some sort of progress towards maybe what we call enlightenment or something, whatever that is. And then after that, I know in certain Buddhist traditions, for example, then there might be a choice as to whether to come back or not to help humanity and all that kind of stuff. But there is a sense, what happens after that? So at some point there is, there's the end of the road, right? There seems to be the end of the road where, and it maybe comes back to what you were saying at the beginning about, something or nothing. Do you see what I'm saying? The end of a lot of, like, particularly study in the non-dual traditions, Advaita traditions and everything, there is a point at which the self is seen as, I suppose, illusory or even non-existent somehow. Yes. So that you would say is the point of nothing, right? So I'm just wondering if this whole notion of kind of some kind of journey through various perhaps incarnations, or but if you don't want to talk about this.
No, well, I mean, the thing that actually kind of works for me quite well, there's, I'm trying to remember, I can't remember the author's name at the moment, but there's an American Californian philosopher, name escapes me, wrote a book about Christianity, which he studied very thoroughly. And the particular thing that he discovered, he went to somewhere and spoke to a Greek Orthodox, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church at the time, that described to him something slightly different, which was the notion that rather than we automatically have a soul when we're born and we develop our soul through successive lives, that nobody has a soul by right, that in our life it's our job to create, to catch, to build, to develop a soul. And if we don't do that, this was the apparently, well, I think I know it's true, the basic Greek Orthodox view of this, that if we don't do that in our lives, when we die, we just go back into the general pool of atoms and whatever the general pool of stuff is, and there's no successive soul. That we have to develop and work on creating a soul. And I'm not saying that's the truth either, but I think that's quite an interesting option, because for something to believe, because if we believe, it's a little bit too easy if I go, well, I've got a soul and it's my job to sort of, be a good person, and if I'm a good person, I'll get good karma or whatever, and I'll get a better life next time. And even if I do something wrong, God is, all forgiving, and I'll be forgiven, and I'll carry on as a soul and have another chance. And it's a little bit like, well, I'm a thief, and I've gone to court, and the judge has said, oh, well, do better next time, off you go, and it's just not quite, it doesn't give you enough oomph to kind of do something about it. If it's like, well, well, you have a chance. There is just that little small millimetre of chance that if you work at it, you might actually develop a soul that does go on in some way to what it's not actually ever described. It encourages people to live a life that actually is more responsible rather than constantly, being able to let oneself go, as it were, with this one. Does this make sense?
Yeah. It's a nice, interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
Different approach. I mean, I think the bottom line for me is really with this, as we don't know what's going to happen to us, and we're still here in life now, why not choose to believe something that actually works for each of us? I choose something, you choose something that works for us. You don't have to be fixed with it. If you're wrong, well, you'll either know about it when you die, because I might believe I'm going to reincarnate again, and I die, and I find out that's not true. God is standing there and says, "Hey, well, you got that wrong, and you can't come into heaven now because you got that wrong," or any silly idea I can make up. Or there will be nothing, and I got it wrong, but I won't know about it. But here in life now, it's going to make a difference. If I spend my life believing that, well, I'll go to an extreme. If I do, I don't think many people actually believe this these days. In fact, probably too many people still do believe it. But if I do really bad things in my life, I will go to some kind of hell and damnation place where I will be in an awful, burning hot, blah, blah, hell. All that imagery of hell, the devil with a pitchfork sort of poking it up my bum all the time. I mean, why would you want to live a life worrying about that? If that is the case, well, it would be pretty awful, I guess. It would be the most awful thing, but deal with it at the time. In life here now, as long as you're living a good, honourable life, it's important for your life now, not for what you might get in the future or not get in the future after you're dead. It doesn't make sense, really. So for me, I think, well, there's a whole range. This is what the book's really about, actually. There's a whole range of different ways that we can, different beliefs we can have, different structures we can create in our lives to give us meaning in life now. It's meaningful for me in my life now to think that what I do now makes a difference to me now and potentially could make a difference in the future. But it's what happens now that's the important thing. And if I believe in reincarnation, I don't know it's true, but if I choose now to believe in reincarnation, actually it's very helpful for me in my life now. It stops me being anxious about well, unless I come back as some, earthworm or something, because I'm such a bad person. I don't. But that's not the kind of reincarnation I believe in anyway. I mean, why not choose something that works for you? If I wanted to believe in when I die, I'll go to the gates of heaven and St. Peter will check out his book and see if I've done well enough or not. If that works for me, that's great. Do it. Do whatever works for you. If you believe there's nothing, and when you die, your atoms and parts, everything makes you up, just go back into some sort of general pool of atomless. There's no religious or spiritual aspect to it. It's just the physicality of life and the structure of the cosmos. Great. If that works for you, believe that. It's what makes your life now meaningful that's important, not what you're doing now might lead to you getting a better or worse time after you're dead.
Sure. I mean, I suppose a lot of people have, they're brought up with very kind of strict religious beliefs, aren't they, all around the world, and that can be quite difficult to see things outside of that kind of structure, I guess, for some people.
Yeah, it can be very difficult. And we see awful things. I just in the newspaper this morning, online newspaper, of course. I just saw a little piece about some Hindu fundamentalists who've been calling, it's in some place in India have been killing Muslims there, calling them, I can't remember the exact term, virus carriers, as if somehow some people that believe a different religious system to you are the people who are responsible for the virus. Or we read silly things like, you know, the new phone masts are what's causing the coronavirus to spread. Apart from being a rather crazy idea, we see how, you know, people will go and destroy masts, which actually enable people to communicate and help one another. Or people on an even more extreme level, because of something they believe, will kill other people who believe something different. I mean, if that happened 100 or 500 years ago, or somewhere in distant history, we could go, oh, you know, gosh, haven't we come a long way? But when we hear and see things like that happening now, I mean, even down to the panic buying, people bashing on supermarket windows because they're so desperate to get something that actually there wasn't even really a need to do at that point. It's all the way it's back to the same story, isn't it? It's how we get caught up with parts of ourselves that start believing something and then lead us down a path that's not really the best path to be going down.
Sure. We probably should stop in a sec, Will, but I'm just wondering if you've got anything else you'd like to say. I mean, there was another chapter in your book called All a Dream, which I'm quite intrigued with. I'm picking the ones that obviously are...
Well, no, you're picking the ones we choose to talk about, probably. Well, I mean, the only thing I'd say, I mean, I could, it's, well, I don't need to read it, I know it. I quote at the beginning of that part of the book, the famous Chuang Tzu thing, the butterfly who, the person that wakes up and has been dreaming he's a butterfly, and he doesn't know whether he is a man who was dreaming he was a butterfly, or actually he's a butterfly who's now dreaming he's a man. We don't actually know, and there is a whole, I mean, many religions in various ways, that thing I was saying about creating a soul even is part of it, that there's something that we can, that basically we're asleep now in our lives. We think we're awake, we think we're here fully incarnated, and yet somehow we're not. There's a, in Kabbalah, there's a very clear teaching about that, I won't go into a lot of detail here, but the idea is that we think we've incarnated fully on the earth, but actually we're still in some kind of strange astral realm, which appears to be the earth, but we haven't fully incarnated ourselves. And our task then is to fully be here. That kind of makes sense to me because what we believe and how we structure our beliefs does seem to be the most significant thing. There's another quote I give in the book from Epictetus, I think his name is. It's one of the old philosophers, Greek philosophers, and he says, well, I've got to die, but do I have to be dragged to death screaming and fighting about it? We don't. What we have to do is find a way to just bring ourselves always more fully into presence here, and presence in an incarnated sense.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there anything else you want to say, Josie, before we stop?
No, I think it's all very interesting. It's very eclectic. I do think death is personal to each and every one, and I think it's a subject that it is advisable to talk about throughout life and with your family. I think everyone, by exploring the possibilities, may get an inner comfort, one that rings true to them. You read books, you study things, you do come into your own sort of belief systems, and it's probably best to go with what is right for you.
Yeah.
Because that is how I feel today, and that is how, as I create what I visualize for the future for me, you know, I might have ambitions or not, or none, or my ambition would be to die in a certain way, and I would believe that even if it was traumatic at the end, the pathway to death is often the thing we worry about most. Well, I would personally believe that I can come in myself and go through that process to something, and whatever that something is to everyone, that is what we are best to go with. I think it's also very important to talk about death with those that are going to be left behind. I mean, that's massively important. You know, I've done this, I've put this in place. And I think people tend to remember people when they've gone for the things that gave them their quality, their spirit, the spirit of the person. And maybe then that helps them when those people go, that they've had this conversation. I think the most important thing is to have the conversation with all those that we are connected with. So, because I actually personally feel to myself that the greater pain is for those that are left behind, the one that has gone, because I sense it as a massive sense of freedom when you're gone. So it's best to have all those relevant conversations so that it isn't, because someone might die suddenly at an unexpected age. So it should be a conversation throughout life. It should be part of our education system. As I say, psychology, human psychology, life, now, death should all be part of what we talk about. And I'm afraid death seems to be excluded from our culture. And I think that's really, really sad. And I hope that what we're going through now does make us all face it. We are all going to leave this world. You know, we might say, well, you know, I walked in the wall yesterday and think, well, I'm not quite ready. I would like to go on a bit longer because there are things, but I may not. So if I do go, I'm in this wood now and it's really beautiful. So I should be able to experience something that's beautiful and free. But that's me. But we can all
beautifully
build our vision. We build our vision.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you very much, Will.
Yes, thanks, Will. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you both too as well.